Hey ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to go through our review of our Native Americans that we studied way at the beginning of the school year. I would like you to try to remember all of the stuff that I said. I doubt that'll happen, but we're going to try it anyway. So let's get started with a review of this video. So this one talks about how the Native Americans would have originally gotten to America. We talked about how during the Ice Age, the water level right here in the Bering Strait would have evaporated. It would have ended up in the glaciers, and so the Native Americans were able to walk across this long land bridge that was about 80 miles long. Towards the end of the Ice Age, all of those glaciers melted, and so they were basically stuck here. Once they got over, they really couldn't go back. Why did they come to begin with? Well, most people think it was because they were following their food. So giant animals like mastodons and woolly mammoths were their main source of food for their families and their tribe. And so where the food went is where they went. And so when the Bering Strait left that open bridge we call the Beringia, the people would have crossed across, and there they are, here in America. Another theory that they had, though, was that they were already here. If you remember, we talked about the story of the giant bird who flew across the land and raised the mountains and lowered the valleys with its wings, and throughout all of its movement, the first man and the first woman crawled out of the earth, and that became humans. And so that was their thought process. They thought that they were always here, that that's just how their creator put them here. So, however we believe it, that's the history of how they happened. One part of their life at the very beginning was that they were nomadic. Nomadic moving, meaning that they were moving from place to place, following their food source and whatnot. So they would have created structures like teepees or wigwams or whatever that were easily moved. They're easily put up. They're also easily taken down so they could travel with their group towards their food source. If you remember at this time in history also, they would use all of the parts of the animal. So you can tell by the picture that they've used the furs for their clothing. They're pretty warmly dressed to go with the time period. Notice right here they have this little dog that's sitting in front of their family. At this time in history, they would have used dogs for transportation purposes. I don't mean that they're going to ride on them, because that would be kind of silly. But what they would do is they would hook something up to them called a travois. It was basically just two poles that would come out from there, and they would use an animal skin in between, and they would pile all their stuff on it, and the dog would help to pull it along the way. Over time, horses are introduced and they're used, but up until then, they would use what they had. So slowly over time, they moved from being this nomadic group moving from place to place to hunting and farming little animals. Why did that happen? Well, it first started out because the climate changed. So when the ice ages ended, the climate got very warm, it got really dry, and some of the animals that they were hunting and following weren't really able to survive anymore. So the mammoths started to die out, and, if I don't have enough food in my fridge, I'm going to go try to find it somewhere else. So they didn't have their mammoths, so they had to go find another source of food, and that slowly changed the way that their lives were lived. They slowly became more civilized, and if you remember, we talked about how civilization, it's when we have a group of people who have similar ways of life, similar ways of doing things, similar ways of learning, and so people started to join together in groups and do that. We talked about 4 specific groups: the Paleo or the Paleolithic, the Archaic, the Woodland, and the Mississippian people. Basically, these were different time periods, and so starting with the Paleo people, climates changed, ways of life changed, and they slowly started to become a settling group of people. Let's start with our paleo people. So this was your nomadic group that we talked about at the beginning. They were hunters and gatherers. They would use the land, use the animals that were available, and they would follow them, and that's how they got what they needed. They used every part of the animal, but they didn't really need anything else. They didn't need to build houses. They didn't need to build communities, because they were quite happy just following around the mammoths. Evidence of this group of people are found at a place called Coates Hines in Williamson County, Tennessee. We found mastodon skeletal remains and different tools that they would have used. So here are some examples. Notice in this picture it's not a teepee that we talked about earlier. This one's more of a wigwam or a hogan or something like that. They are making baskets, probably to carry some things from place to place, but nothing majorly heavy, not anything massive. These right here look kind of like clay pots. Please forget those, because they probably wouldn't have happened at this time in history. They didn't settle in one place, and so they probably wouldn't have needed those. So I'm not sure why those are in that picture. However, on this side, you can see they're using spears and arrows, so they probably would have found evidence of arrowheads and spearheads that would have been used to kill the animals to get the things that they needed. Our second group are the archaic Indians. Again, as the climate changed, the food sources started to change, and so they had to make different tools, different traps to catch smaller animals. Smaller in this sense might not be bunny rabbits and squirrels. It'd probably be more things like your deer, your buffalo, your bison, the bigger animals. So those are also traveling animals, so they still would have had to travel with their food, but probably not super long distances, and maybe not as often as they would have before. And so this gave them a little bit more leeway to grow plants and to have smaller little settlements that would stay in a certain area. They would start making containers, because if you're planting, that means you have seeds. If you have seeds, that means you need something to hold it in. So they would have started making things like baskets and that kind of thing. So here in your examples, you have them more fishing communities, planting things and gathering from around the area. Streams were very important at this time to catch fish, to catch shellfish, that kind of thing. So a pretty drastic change from traveling all the time after your food. Your third group are your woodland Indians. Agriculture started to become extremely important at this time. So they would have been farming, and this is where you get your three sisters, your corn, your beans, your squash, all being grown in the same field, because they didn't need to have massive fields, just a little one. So they would have started growing that stuff. So the communities would have grown bigger. This is where we start to see our mound building communities. This example right here is Pinson Mounds, which is here in Tennessee, out towards the western part. We'll talk more about mounds in a few minutes, but they were used for several different reasons, and evidence of them have been left behind that we can still study today. This group of people would have, like I said, had more communities. The idea of having tribes would have grown at this time, where people live together, they have different jobs, they have roles in the community. We'll talk about those more when we talk specific tribes in a few minutes. Their house structure was different now, though. Instead of having movable structures, they started building things like longhouses. Several different families would live in the same place. They would have a central fire that was burning all the time. They would have cooked food together. They also had the need of protection, so they would have built these palisades around the outside. Remember, sharp, pointy tops at the top, so that intruders can't get in, but also they were able to see over them to get things done. Our last group, though, is your Mississippians. If you remember, this was my all-time favorite group of people. Not because they're awesome necessarily, just because it was a cool thing to study. So this group of people lived in communities also, but they were known mostly by living around the Mississippi River Valley area. They would have their communities along the water because of several different reasons. You need to have transportation, you need to have water for drinking, you need bathing places, they needed water for irrigation for their crops, and so they would have paths for that. The cool thing about these guys is their mound building. So they built their mounds for 3 different main reasons. The very first one would be to hold temples or main worship places, kind of like this one, only I think it would be a little bit higher. If you remember, we talked about them being almost 3 stories high, 90 feet, I believe, is what we talked about, with a temple on top because they wanted to be as high to the heavens as they could. Another reason that we talked about, or that they would have mounds for, were effigies. So this one right here is in the shape of a snake, and so that would have held some specific significance to them, and so they wanted to pay tribute to that, and so they would build a mound that would represent that. The grossest but coolest of all were that they used their mounds for burials. This one is a really neat representation that I found the other day. But remember that they would have started off with a smaller mound that they built to bury, whoever died. And then slowly over time, as more people died in the community, the mound would get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it was pretty high up in the air. So you can see over at this one, we've got some short mounds like the one that I showed you in the last picture, but then back here at the back, you've got one of those really massively high ones. So the temple probably would have been up here. They would have the river, see it's flowing through the middle, very important for the resources that they needed. So these are what we call our ancient Native Americans. In the next section, we'll talk about specific groups in Tennessee and the things that were specific to them that we needed to study. Hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see what happens in the next one.